Elizabeth Williamson writes for the New York Times, and I wanted to get some expertise here on this Alex Jones case. Many of you perhaps noticed the viral video last week from a courtroom that, Elizabeth, I thought that I was misinterpreting something, and thank you for joining us. The idea that all of that could play out in a courtroom and that Alex Jones's attorney could accidentally send over information to the other attorney that shows that Alex Jones perjured himself is a thing that I had never seen in any kind of trial, never mind a celebrity trial. So thank you for joining us, and tell me what happened there, first of all.
Sure. So what happened there was they were sending over materials. So the lawyer for Alex Jones, a guy named Andino Reynal, representing him, for somehow someone in his office sent over an enormous document dump, like several hundred gigabytes worth of material, over to the lawyers for the Sandy Hook families in Texas. And nobody quite knows how this happened, but contained within that was the contents of Alex Jones' cell phone, the entire contents, including hundreds, maybe thousands of text messages that he, to that point, had been saying didn't exist, that he didn't have text messages, that he never spoke about Sandy Hook by text. And it was kind of funny to me because I had, when I was writing my book, I had been contacting him a lot about Sandy Hook, and often by text message. And when he was saying in discovery for these trials that he didn't have any text messages that said Sandy Hook in them, I thought, oh no.
What level of incompetence is that? Have you seen something like that before?
I don't think many folks had. I mean, there were a couple of lawyers that I was sort of corresponding with during the trial who were helping, make sense of Texas law, et cetera. And they were absolutely stunned.
Take us through the history with this trial, because you have a level of expertise that is uncommon. What are the parts of this story that you believe are most interesting, historic, stimulating?
So, the thing is with these cases, first of all, he lost. These are a series. The reason that we had this trial in the first place is that there were a series of lawsuits filed by the families of 10 Sandy Hook victims. So 4 different lawsuits altogether. Late last year, Jones was defaulted in all of them. So they were defamation cases. So he was found liable for defamation in all 4 of them, because for nearly 4 years, he'd been stonewalling in the run-up to trial. He was refusing to submit to testimony. He wasn't sending staffers in who had been, called to testify. He was defying court orders to produce financial records and business documents. And so finally, at the end of last year, judges in 2 states, Texas and Connecticut, had had enough of this. And so they ruled him, liable by default. So these trials, there are 3 of them. Last week's trial was the first. And this is, in these trials, the juries are instructed solely to decide how much he has to pay the families in damages. So that's all they have to decide. He would like to make this a trial about free speech, but that ship has sailed. He lost his opportunity to talk about that in court. And this is just about how much he has to fork over to these families for defaming them for years after the 2012 shooting.
What's going to happen to Alex Jones?
That's hard to say. He's now declared bankruptcy again. So he's trying to protect his assets that way. He's trying to delay the remaining 2 trials. In Texas, they have some pretty strict caps on what plaintiffs can collect in damages. So even though, we had a verdict of nearly $50 million, probably all but about $5 million of that, those families will not see because of Texas law that caps punitive damages. But the biggest case of these 3 trials is brought by the families of 8 victims in Connecticut, where punitive damages aren't capped in that way. So that would be a really big hit to him, which is why he's declared bankruptcy, to try and protect his assets. This will probably wind on for years, but in the meantime, there's a moral point, of course, being made about the spread of disinformation and false narratives that really harm vulnerable people like this. But the broader point is, of course, that Alex Jones has had his fingerprints on all the big disinformation campaigns of the past decade since the Sandy Hook shooting. You know, he's called most mass shootings false flags. He's spread coronavirus myths. He had a role in Charlottesville, the Great Replacement Theory, Pizzagate, and of course, Stop the Steal and the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So bringing him down would be striking at least a symbolic blow against online disinformation.
What have you learned in the coverage of all of this over the years about disinformation, about the power that this man accrued?
You know, just looking at the damage done to the Sandy Hook families by the lies that he has spread about the shooting and about them personally. I mean, it was a really dark turn to name individual family members on his show because he's got tens of millions of listeners. And so if even a tiny percentage of these people believes this and decides to take action, he was saying that these families were complicit in a government plot to confiscate Americans' firearms. And so his listeners were like, wow, these people sound like they did it for the money, or, you know, they were party with the government in trying to take our guns. And so people were, you know, stalking them online. They were abusing them. They were showing up at their houses, looking in their windows, digging through their trash and confronting them on the street and threatening their lives. And this went on for years. So, you know, if anything, I got a really clear window onto the human impact of, you know, what we've seen, this sort of rise of disinformation in the culture and online.
How long have you been covering Alex Jones?
So I started covering this in mid-2018 when the families filed their lawsuits in, like I said, in Texas and Connecticut. Soon after, I decided that I wanted to write a book about this because initially I thought this would be a signal test of free speech. And, you know, does the First Amendment protect somebody who spreads these kinds of damaging falsehoods? But then it sort of grew into a broader story about disinformation because I talked with Lenny Posner, who is the father of Noah Posner, the youngest Sandy Hook victim. He has a tech background. He knows how social media algorithms spread this material. And he was basically saying, look, this is a foundational story in how misinformation and false narratives have spread. And he was really right. And so, you know, the book that I wrote really had a lot to do with, you know, what he convinced me of and what I could see sort of play out over the intervening years, sort of culminating with January 6th and the attack on the Capitol.
The reason I asked the question on how long you've been covering this is because I would like for you, with that level of expertise that goes into authoring and vetting a book on this kind of subject matter, to explain to me how he got tens of millions of followers, the psychology of it. How did that work?
Yeah, that was really interesting. So he was in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, he kind of started to break more into the mainstream in that he was a vociferous, you know, defender of the Second Amendment. So he went on CNN, you know, Piers Morgan had him on, he was on Howard Stern. He kind of crossed over into sort of mainstream media interviews. But it was really his connection with former President Trump that put him into, you know, dragged him from the fringes into kind of the center of Republican Party politics. And so in the years from Sandy Hook in 2012 to 2015, when he had Trump on InfoWars at the end of 2015, his audience more than doubled. And people became much more ideologically driven. And that was when, you know, you started to see some real activity, you know, around, not only around Sandy Hook, but, you know, kind of against the so-called targets of a lot of his conspiracy theories.
Could you have seen in 2018 even something that would be at the center of what happened January 6th? Would it have been possible to you, even as things accelerated in 2016, to imagine that as some sort of mastermind leader?
No, because when I first started writing about the book, or, you know, writing the book, I really felt like this is a very interesting phenomenon. We could see, disinformation proliferating online. You had the whole Russian interference in the campaign in 2016. So there was a lot to talk about, but I never really thought that it would move from, targeting vulnerable individuals to really kind of chipping away at the foundation of our democracy, because you had a conspiracy-minded president who was willing to, appeal to these people who have always been out there, but they'd always been sort of shunned by most of society, including our political candidates. But, what happened with Alex Jones was he tapped into a constituency that Trump then used to help put him over the top in a really crowded Republican primary field. He was willing to speak to those people's paranoia and fears with sort of nativist language. And, he fueled their kind of paranoia and made it feel like, this was a guy who speaks for us and speaks to us. And that was important.
Have you seen the fear on Alex Jones?
You mean from last week? I definitely saw it last week. That was unbelievable in the courtroom. It was really an accident of scheduling that Scarlett Lewis, who is one of the two plaintiffs, the mother of Jesse Lewis, who's the 6-year-old who was killed at Sandy Hook, that she was coming in to testify. Well, no, she was in to testify in the morning. Then there was a lunch break. And because she hadn't finished, she was going to testify some more in the afternoon. What he was banking on was that he'd blow off the trial until after lunch. He would turn up in time for his testimony, and he would never have to sort of face off with the parents. He was a no-show for a big chunk of this trial. And when he showed up and she hadn't finished testifying, for the remaining 90 minutes of her testimony, she directed all her comments directly at him. It was like, Alex, I want you to pay attention to me. He was squirming. He was trying not to look at her. He was sweating. He was fidgeting in his seat. And she just kept fixing him in her gaze, and she would not let him look away. And she was just like, why? Why did you do this? I don't understand. This isn't true. Is this for money? And of course, that is the answer. So I have never seen him like that. But I have to say, as bad as that was for him, the revelation of those text messages that he didn't know anyone had, that was even worse. He was literally sweating through his shirt.
Well, that scene, beyond flabbergasting, people who might not have been paying attention to that trial, who just like courtroom drama, you might not even know who Alex Jones is or care about anything. That scene somehow arrives in a place that spreads like news does these days, to cause him a shame that was unfathomable, and his attorney as well. Like, I don't know how the two of them didn't just sink into the earth, because now you're perjuring yourself on top of everything else in a way that's easily proven.
Yeah, and just the day before. So, I mean, there was another moment where the lawyers for the family produced clips of his show from the day before where he was maligning the judge and the jury. He was calling the jury stupid. He was saying they were extremely blue-collar people who'd been handpicked by his political enemies because they needed people who were too dumb to assess the charges against him. It was just unbelievable. And to play that in the courtroom while he sat there was, that was just incredible. And for him, he's used to sort of dominating the space where he is, right? His show, he's on blast and no one else gets a word in edgewise. And so to have him sit there and be sort of confronted with facts, this is a guy who's not accustomed to facts, and being in a courtroom like that, it was something unreal.
The psychology of Alex Jones, is it as simple as money? The whole thing, is it as simple as money?
I think that probably oversimplifies it a bit. He is a conspiracy-minded person. He started out, in Austin in the late 90s. He was sort of a feature of the funky culture in Austin. He was part of, what makes Austin, kind of welcome its weirdos. And he was more innocuous then, saying the moon landing was faked or something like that is a far cry from what he was doing in the case of Sandy Hook. But he did get darker and darker. And he has always had ties to sort of like Western extremists. Stuart Rhodes is an old friend of his, the founder of the Oath Keepers, who was, so heavily involved in January 6th. He went out to Waco and he rebuilt the Branch Davidian Church after the FBI siege there. So he's always kind of tapped into that stream of extremism, but he was never, as malevolent a force as he began to be, especially with Sandy Hook, where you're naming grieving parents and saying they're liars.
Elizabeth, thank you for being on with us. Thank you for all the work you've done on this story.